some crisp take-home messages. To you, myeloproliferative neoplasms are a heterogeneous and complex group of clonal hematopoietic disorders. There is proliferation of either the granulocytes or the erythrocytes or the megakaryocytes with relatively normal maturation, meaning that it is not leukemia. The blast cells are not increased or minimally increased to start with at least. And 2016 was the last concerted effort to classify these diseases, and they were classified into these 7 broad diseases: CML, chronic neutrophilic leukemia, eosinophilic leukemia, and hypereosinophilic syndromes, polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, myelofibrosis, and chronic myeloproliferative disorders unclassified. So this was the conventional classification, the BCR-ABL positive myeloproliferative neoplasms, chronic myeloid leukemia. So we will not be talking about this today. We will be focusing on these 3 entities: polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, and primary myelofibrosis. And we will be focusing more on the treatment of primary myelofibrosis. And here you can see the various mutations which are present in these neoplasms. We will again not be talking about these rare myeloproliferative neoplasms, which you will hardly see in your career, maybe 1 or 2. We've seen less than 5 patients in my 30-odd years. So we focus on primarily this group of disorders today. So, as I already mentioned, the myeloproliferative neoplasms could be BCR-ABL positive. That is chronic myeloid leukemia. We've had several webinars on this, so we will not consider this today. We will focus on the BCR-ABL negative myeloproliferative neoplasms, and these are the classical ones are primary myelofibrosis, prefibrotic and overt fibrotic, and I think Dr. Jay Mehta will very comprehensively tell you the difference between these two. We'll be talking a little bit, particularly in the case-based discussions on PV and ET. And we will not talk too much on the non-classical ones because they are too rare to spend too much time on. So this is what we are going to focus on today, and it is my pleasure to invite to you the next speaker, and Dr. Jayanta. Dr. Jay, one of the key for chemistry. Yeah. You need to unmute yourself. Okay, but go. Okay. 10 minutes. And I do a lot of. Sorry, I'm just getting. This MPNs are clonal hematopoietic stem. Okay, this MPNs are clonal hematopoietic stem cell disorders, and these are characterized by proliferation of any of these cell lineages: granulocytic lineage, erythroid lineage, megakaryocytic lineage, or rarely mast cells also. Now, mastocytosis is incredibly rare in our country, and so are the other non-classical ones like chronic neutrophilic leukemia and chronic eosinophilic leukemia. So the 4 major MPNs are, as we know, CML and the non-pH positives, ET, that's essential thrombocythemia, polycythemia vera, and myelofibrosis. The WHO classification incorporates clinical, morphologic criteria, immunophenotypic features, and genetic information to define categories as really distinct biologic entities. And why do we need to do that? Because they have a very specific clinical behavior, and you can predict its outcome and therefore the treatment as well. So the broad approach to MPNs as something as BCR-ABL positive, so that's CML. Remember that there's no such thing as a BCR-ABL negative CML. There's nothing like atypical CML. Every CML has to be BCR-ABL positive. The non-BCR-ABL positives include ET, that's essential thrombocythemia, PV, and PMF. And that's how the basic split is taken up for the diagnostic purposes. Now, as far as histology goes, there are a lot of features that a pathologist will take into consideration, and I'm not going to bore you with really all of them. But these 3 things are very important for a pathologist. The megakaryocyte is the key. What the megakaryocyte looks like will tell you what the diagnosis is. So we have to look at its topography and its morphology.
we are obliged to offer a myelofibrosis score, and we are obliged to actually quantitate the progenitor cells or the blast cells by carrying out immunostaining with CD117, that's c-Kit, and CD34. Now, when I say megakaryocyte is a key histologic feature, normally you find single isolated cells in the marrow, between the marrow trabeculae. When you have paratrabecular localization of megakaryocytes, that's an abnormal finding. Even in reactive thrombocytosis, one should not be seeing that. In MPNs, the increase in megakaryocytes is associated with them being clustered. So that's like about 3 to 5 cells. If it's more than 5 cells, you call them as groups. Now, the clusters may themselves show loose or dense arrangement. Megakaryocytes also show nuclear abnormality. So normally, megakaryocyte will have about 4 to 5 lobes. When you have hypolobation, it looks more cloud-like or bulbous, and I'll show you some pictures. And when it's hyperlobate, it's actually lobated more than 5 lobes or 6 lobes, and therefore it looks very staghorn-like. The other nuclear abnormalities include its increase in cytoplasmic size, and you might have bizarre forms, as well as a nuclei which will be hyperchromatic. And all of these changes can be seen in all kinds of megakaryocytes, small, medium, large, or giant. So all kinds of megakaryocytes in MPNs can show all the above features. Now this is a picture which is depicting some size. This is a small megakaryocyte, a dwarf one, something medium, and this is a large size one. Look at the nucleus here. It's bulbous and hypolobate versus here where it is staghorn. It's hyperlobate. This is a loose cluster and this is a dense cluster. In loose cluster, you will find some of the other hematopoietic cells between the megakaryocytes. Here you will find seldom anything between them. So that defines a loose versus dense or a tight cluster. Now these are histology images. I wouldn't expect you to know everything, but you can surely identify this two megakaryocytes here as staghorn. But look at this kind of antler of a deer. This is just multiple hyperlobations. Versus this one with an arrow pointed here shows very bulbous or hypolobate. It's cloud-like. And in CML, you see very dwarf megakaryocytes. So these are the key features which help you identify the various myeloproliferative neoplasms. Pathologists are obliged to give a myelofibrosis score ranging from 0, that is normal, to 3. And this is how it looks. The top left looks normal versus 1, 2, and 3. This is grade 1, this is grade 2 and grade 3. So we are obliged to offer. But what you do get is a very hypercellular marrow. You get this very peculiar dwarf megakaryocytes, there is granulocytic hyperplasia and reduced erythropoiesis. Now this is the paratrabecular, that's the paratrabecular bone. Here it's very tiny BCR-ABL. Biology of BCR-ABL negative MPNs includes investigation for JAK2, CALR, and MPL mutations. In polycythemia vera, you find mainly JAK2 mutations. Very rarely you find the exon 12 mutation also active. As far as essential thrombocythemia goes, about half of them harbor JAK2 mutations. Quarter of them have the CALR exon 9 insertions and deletions. The deletions are type 1 and insertions are called type 2. It's important to know this because they have variably different prognosis. And there are MPL mutations also rarely in essential thrombocythemia. The flavor of the day, primary myelofibrosis, about 60% have the JAK2 mutations, about 25% harbor the CALR mutations, and 10% may have MPL exon 10 mutations. Now, there is such a thing as a triple negative. Nothing in biology is 100%. And some of the MPNs are negative for all the above mutations. About 2% of polycythemia veras are triple negative, and anywhere between 10 to 15% of myelofibrosis and ET could also be triple negative. Won't spend much time on this big complex graphic of JAK2 mutation. But remember, it's a function mutation. So what happens is if you acquire this mutation, there's proliferation. But remember that this is myeloid neoplasm specific. It's not MPN specific. So JAK2 can be seen in myelodysplastic syndromes. You can get in overlap MPN, MDS syndromes, AMLs. Also, sometimes CMMLs can actually show you a JAK2 mutation. As far as CALR mutation goes, remember that it's never seen in polycythemia vera. And just like the JAK does, it actually stimulates the JAK STAT signaling pathway either through cytokine-independent growth of hematopoietic cells or through a TPO-independent activation of the thrombopoietin receptor, and this leads to proliferation. MPL mutations code for the thrombopoietin receptor. Normal physiology, binding of the TPO, that's a thrombopoietin, to its receptor, it initiates signaling to JAK2. When you have mutations in MPL, which encodes the TPO, there is loss of autoinhibition of the TPO receptor, and therefore it's just constantly switched on. Now, primary myelofibrosis, the marrow is hypercellular. You get granulocytic hyperplasia and you get reduced erythropoiesis. Now, reduced erythropoiesis is only seen PMF. You do not see that with PV and with ET. And you get a very typical atypical megakaryocytes with bulbous nuclei. But before you embark on a diagnosis of myelofibrosis, one should actually rule out secondary causes of myelofibrosis. Now, myeloid neoplasms such as CML, ETPV themselves can cause myelofibrosis. So any kind of fibrosis does not equate to a diagnosis of primary myelofibrosis. You need to see those specific megakaryocytic abnormalities. MDS, megakaryocytic leukemias, mast cell disease all can cause fibrosis as well. Lymphoid neoplasms, particularly hairy cell leukemia and myelomas, can cause myelofibrosis. In non-hematologic conditions, metastatic disease, autoimmune disorders such as SLE, rickets, renal osteodystrophy, and HIV can also cause myelofibrosis. So here on the top left, you see this very characteristic osteosclerosis, very dense, thick bone. And as hematologists, you will yourself realize when you find it difficult to actually tap the marrow because it's really thick, hard bone and it's fibrotic. And you see this very typical bulbous cloud-like nucleus here. You can see this, it's hypolobate nucleus, and there is hyperchromatism. It looks extremely blue vis-a-vis this grayish color that you see in the bystander cells. Now, as far as the pre-fibrotic phase goes, how do you distinguish that? And it can be kind of overlapping with the features that you once sees in essential thrombocythemia. So the really trick to see that is that if you get a lot of fibrosis, you seldom get fibrosis in essential thrombocythemia. If you get any variable degree of fibrosis that favors a cellular phase of primary myelofibrosis or the prefibrotic phase, and the distinguishing features would be the megakaryocyte morphology. If you see this bulbous nuclei, that is not AT, that has to be the precellular or the prefibrotic phase of primary myelofibrosis. Now, as far as polycythemia goes, you get a marrow which is hypercellular. Here, all the three lineages are proliferating, so you get panmyelosis. There is clusters of erythroid precursors, granulopoiesis is expand, and megakaryocytes here are pleomorphous, which means that the same cell is showing different features. That means it's a spectrum ranging from small, medium, large to giant forms, and they may have variable nuclear hypolobation or hyperlobation. Either of them you can find in this. So I'm going to show you this picture here. You can see this megakaryocytes. They're all various sizes, ranging from something which is really small, medium here, is large, and there's something which is giant form here. And you can see there is abnormal nuclear lobations in all of them. This is the CD61 immunostain that we use for megakaryocytes, and you can see that it's also showing you the pleomorphous nature. And you see this in TV, expanded erythroid islands. These are all megaloblastic erythroid cells. Glycophorin is a marker for erythroid cells. And you see this expansion of, this is the MPO stage, which is the myeloid cells, which are expanded. So you see left shift. Now, as far as ET goes, as far as comparison with the other MPNs, the marrow is remarkably normal here. The ME ratio is also maintained. So the only thing that you see here is the megakaryocytes, which are abnormal, but thankfully they are so abnormal that nobody can miss this kind of a staghorn-like antler feature here. Megakaryocytes are enormously enlarged, huge forms, and look at this. We are also obliged as pathologists to offer you the blast count because that's very important and crucial, because you need to know that at diagnosis and at follow-up to document the disease acceleration or transformation, which means there's a blast crisis, or prior to that if there's an accelerated phase. Now, so just to wind up, the WHO classification is really reproducible to an extent if all the histologic criteria are adhered to. It does not guarantee 100% specificity. There are always overlaps in real life. Things are not as simple as I showed you. However, it does create an interface between the hematologic data that one has, the histology, the immunohistochemistry for blast counts, and the molecular findings to arrive at a working diagnosis. So histopathology can be tricky while you're interpreting negative MPNs. However, if you follow a systematic algorithmic approach, if you look for the ME ratios, you can check the erythropoiesis, You can check the blast counts, you can check for the megakaryocyte morphology and its topography. It just makes life easy and interpretation much better. And I think that's it. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Well, Shah, my very good scores medical at the trans and the technology was. So Sangeet, the screen is yours.
Since full of last COVID is not into the prognostic models and scores for myeloproliferative neoplasm. So we need this score for this stratification and to decide which patient will need treatment and which patient can be observed or which patient would be submitted for allogenic transplantation. And although polycythemia vera and essential thrombocythemia is more common than primary myelofibrosis, most of these scoring models are for primary myelofibrosis and not for polycythemia or essential thrombocythemia. But still, polycythemia vera, the common complications in both EP and PV is hemorrhagic or thrombotic disorders. The primary aim is to prevent these thrombosis or hemorrhage. So PV is basically low risk PV is age less than 60 years and no history of thrombosis. They are low risk PV and high risk PV is age more than 60 years and history of thrombosis. While it is divided in 4 groups: very low risk disease, low risk disease, intermediate risk disease, and high risk disease. The variables or parameters are history of thrombosis, age less than 60 years and JAK2 unmutated, then it is very low risk disease. And low risk disease, no history of thrombosis, age less than 60 years, but JAK2 is mutated. Intermediate risk, age more than 60 years, no history of thrombosis and JAK2 is unmutated. While high risk disease, history of thrombosis or age more than 60 years with JAK2 mutated. And accordingly, so very low risk disease, as such, no treatment or you can just give a pill of aspirin. For high risk disease, cytoreductive therapy is required. Similarly, for polycythemia vera, for high risk disease, cytoreductive therapy is required. Otherwise, most of the patients are subjected to So coming to, there is no validated prognostic model for polycythemia or essential thrombocythemia. Coming to prognostic models of scores for myelofibrosis, started from 2009 first in IPSS, prognosis scoring system, then TIPS plus, and then came genetic and on the basis of genetics and HGS mutations, MIPS and GPSS. And then for secondary myelofibrosis, much. So if we consider this IPSS, DIPS and DIPS plus, these are the commonest scoring models which are used in clinical practice. So 5 factors for IPSS are age more than 65 years, constitutional symptoms, hemoglobin less than 10 gram, leukocyte count more than 25,000, and circulating class more than 1%, which gives 1 scoring point. DIPS, 10, 5 parameters are used, and DIPS plus, these 3 parameters are added: platelet count, RBC transfusion need, and unfavorable karyotype. You can see in this graph that on IPSS scoring model, if patient is low risk and the survival is 11.2 years compared to high risk patient, the survival is 2.3 years. For DIPS, again these 5 parameters compared to IPSS, the hemoglobin less than 10 parameter has 2 points, while in IPSS it has 1 point. According to it is scoring on the basis of score, it is divided in low risk, intermediate 1 risk, intermediate 2 risk, and high risk. And you can see the median survival is 18 months for high risk patient, and compared to not tips for low risk patients and 170 months for intermediate risk 1 patients. So DIPS plus scoring is again done. It's same as DIPS, but there are three parameters are added. So the DIPS score is taken up, and then the three additional parameters: abnormal karyotype, platelet count less than 100,000, RBC transfusion 1 for each. So those points are combined, and accordingly low risk, intermediate, 1 risk, 2 and high patients. And according to, you can see the survival for high risk patients is 16 months compared to 185 months for low risk patients. So the most commonly used scores in clinical practice are the DIPS plus, and they are improvement of the IPS score. Although the IPS is only valid at diagnosis, while the DIPS score is valid anytime during the treatment or during the course of the disease. The IPSS, these factors are manipulated at the time points, leading to development of dynamic IPSS, which can be used at any time point in patient's clinical course. The main advantage of the DIPS is that it can be used quickly in the clinic to risk detection when no karyotypic or molecular information are available. So now coming to MIP-70, which is mutation enhanced prognostic score system for transplant age patient, which is less than 70 years for primary myelofibrosis. And you can see these are the parameters. Here the parameters mainly are high molecular risk mutation category, and more than 2 high molecular risk mutations carries 2 scores. Accordingly, the scores, the patients are divided in low risk, intermediate risk and high risk. And you can see the low risk patient have a overall survival of 27.7 months, while intermediate risk has 7.1 months and high risk has 2.3 years, sorry, not in months, in years. So coming to MIP-70 plus, which is same as MIPS, but here the unfavorable karyotype is added to the above previous variables. And again, same thing, patients are divided in 4 risk category, and you can see the low risk patients have a very good survival of 20 years compared to 1.7 years for high risk patients. This is version 2 of MIP-70, and again patients are divided in the same 4 version, and the specific abnormality of karyotype is added in this. And come to the my slides are moving automatically. So coming to MIPS conclusion, the primary objective in developing MIP-70 and MIP-70 plus was to improve our ability to select patients for allo transplant procedure. Allo transplant, the only curative option in PMF, may be proposed when the expected survival of patients with conventional therapy is less than 5 years. The 3-tiered MIP-70 score reliably identified high-risk patients with a median survival of 2.3 years. The risk of death 81% at 5 years. This could justify the upfront use of allogeneic transplant. So this is another clinical molecular transplant scoring system for myelofibrosis. And so this is scoring model for those patients who are undergoing the actual transplant. And we can predict survival of these patients on the basis of this scoring system. And you can see the performance status is added here, age is added here, and again HLA mismatch unrelated, then the score is 2. So mismatched donor has a high risk. So according to low risk, intermediate risk, and high and very high risk patients are divided and can predict the survival on the basis of this score. So you can expect patient before transplant what can be your survival. This is another scoring model which is genetically inspired prognostic scoring system. There are no lab features or clinical features in this scoring model. It includes karyotype, driver mutations, and high risk mutations. So again, patients are divided in 4 groups: low risk, intermediate 2 risk, and high risk patients. And according to, you can see the high risk group has a 5-year survival of only 14%, by low risk patient has 5-year survival 94%. If you overlap this GIPS and MIP-70, there are a lot of overlapping in both the groups. So you can say that none of the this model is 100% perfect. And there will be a lot of overlapping if you combine two scoring models. So TIPS offers a low complexity and practical risk model for PMF that is based exclusively on karyotype and limited number of mutations including AS, XL1, SRSF2, U2AF1, and TAL reticulin. It should not be considered as a finished product, but rather a template for incorporating additional genetic information. And one can envision a stepwise prognostication approach in PMF. They start with the simple TIPS model that is based on karyotype and mutation only. And you can reliably select candidates for allogeneic transplant on the basis of this TIPS classification or TIPS model. Particularly high-risk disease patient can be submitted for transplantation. So prognosis scoring for second myelofibrosis. Here you can see that MySEC, which is myelofibrosis secondary to PV and PT, which is a molecular enriched prognostic model. And here you can see that as the age increases, the risk increases. So in high risk group, most of the patients are more than 55 years of age. So even if there are more other risk parameters, but if the age is less than 55, then none of them will be in a high risk group. So age is the main parameter in MySEC. And other parameters are hemoglobin, platelet count, peripheral blast more than 3%, TAL reticulin, wild type, and constitutional symptoms. And accordingly, patients are divided in low, intermediate, 1, 2, and high risk patients. So, and this was another proposed personalized risk calculator, which was published in 2020 only. Still, it is not validated, but in future it will be validated. And these are the 8 parameters for it, and I won't go in detail for that. So, at a glance, if you see all the parameters, then this IPSS and IPSS is important at the time of diagnosis, while TIPS and TIPS plus they can give us information or risk certification at the time of diagnosis as well as during the course of the disease or during the treatment. At the same time, this MTSS is to be done just before the transplant to predict the outcome of the transplant. So the key take-home message is prognosis scores are important because they allow comparison of results between different clinical trials. They facilitate discussions amongst physicians, provide guidance for initiating talks about treatment and or transplantation. Nevertheless, it must be acknowledged that all these prognostic treatment systems for MF have been based on retrospective analysis and have not been confirmed prospectively. Additionally, all scores lack significant information including marrow biopsy findings and degree of splenomegaly. And none of the scoring model or prognostic model is 100% perfect because there will be a lot of overlapping. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Sandeep Bhai, for a wonderful summary and give you an overview of the treatment of myeloproliferative, which is a disease in India. So, as I mentioned, it's a heterogeneous disease, and you have myelofibrosis here. You have a small group of pre-fibrotic myelofibrosis, and then you have the secondary myelofibrosis. Polycythemia vera can lead to myelofibrosis. PT can lead to myelofibrosis, and there is a lot of overlap between all these myeloproliferative neoplasms. And it is important to differentiate what you are dealing with because the prognosis, although there are a lot of similarities in the molecular signature and presentation, but it's important to differentiate them because the survival and the progression and the prognosis and the treatment differs. So this is the line which is expected survival of normal population. These are the patients who have ET. These are the patients who have PV. And these are the patients who have primary myelofibrosis or overt myelofibrosis. And you can see that PMF, myelofibrosis, has the worst prognosis of the other myeloproliferative neoplasms. The transformation to acute myeloid leukemia, of which all of us are scared, that again is commonest with BMF. And BMF is a progressive disease, so you have to periodically, repeatedly assess the patient. And you can see in this table that at diagnosis and 1 year after diagnosis, there are significantly more number of patients who develop anemia, thrombocytopenia, circulating blasts, transfusion requirement, constitutional symptoms, increasing splenomegaly, and unfavorable karyotypes. So even if you diagnose a patient with myelofibrosis and he is low risk, as if you use one of Dr. Sandeep's prognostic models, that patient has to be very carefully followed up because there is going to be progression. And even if you have diagnosis, the patient doesn't require treatment. Very soon the patient will be in the category where treatment is required. So basically it's a personalized disease in the sense that each patient has his own set of problems. And of course you have the baseline paramedics, you have age, the concomitant medication the patient is taking, comorbidities which the patient is taking, then on top of that, myeloproliferative related triad, splenomegaly, which happens in almost 86% of patients. It has its own problems of massive splenomegaly. You know that almost 80% of patients have systemic symptoms. About 40% of patients have anemia requiring transfusions. And in addition to this, there are issues of thrombosis, thrombocytopenia, bleeding manifestations, extramedullary hematopoiesis, bone pains, risk of leukemia. Some patients have leukopenia and leukocytosis, and some patients have infections. So the patient may present with more than one of these problems, and it is important to personalize treatment for each patient. A uniform treatment policy for all patients cannot be laid down. And also, as I mentioned, you have to reassess the patient at periodic intervals so that you catch any deterioration and catch any symptom which is impacting on the patient's daily activity. And all these symptoms are basically manifestations of overstimulation of the JAK2 pathway, which leads to hyperproliferation, extramedullary hematopoiesis. Again, this leads to the anemia which most of the patients have. This leads to release of cytokines and produce the very debilitating constitutional symptoms which patient has. And this is the symptom burden which the patient usually faces. Almost two-thirds of the patients have constitutional symptoms. More than 3/4 have spleen-related symptoms like early satiety, abdominal discomfort, abdominal pains. Symptoms related to myeloproliferation happens in about half of the patients and are manifested by bone pains and itching. And a majority of the patients have fatigue, inactivity, insomnia, itching, which can sometimes be very, very distressing for the patient. Now, the treatment options for patients with myelofibrosis conventionally used to be observation, some conventional treatments, investigational drugs, allogeneic stem cell transplantation, and now in the past decade, we have a specific agent available to us, the JAK2 inhibitors. You may also want to keep in mind that the treatment is related to the risk and the symptoms which the patient has. If the patient is low risk and is minimally symptomatic, that patient may not need any specific treatment. He or she may just needs to be observed. If he has many symptoms, a JAK2 inhibitor might be indicated. If the patient is intermediate risk 1, intermediate risk 2, you may think of ruxolitinib anemia treatment and or transplant. If the patient is in high risk, like intermediate risk 2 and high risk, and is in the right age for transplant as a donor, then the treatment of choice, the curative treatment is stem cell transplantation. But if the patient is not a candidate for this, then you may consider medical treatment in the form of a JAK2 inhibitor and amelioration of anemia. So these were the historical treatments which we used to offer the patient for splenomegaly. We would give the patient most commonly hydroxyurea, sometimes any one of these other agents. For anemia, we would give them corticosteroids, androgens, IMiDs, and now we've started to use erythropoietic stimulating agents. For leukocytosis and thrombocytosis, we would bring that down by cytotoxic agents like hydroxyurea, sometimes thalidomide, sometimes these old-fashioned busulfan and myluran, interferon, enigleride. Constitutional symptoms, historically, we did not have anything. But now, in the current day, for the current treatment of patients with myelofibrosis, specifically for patients who have distressing splenomegaly, we have the JAK2 inhibitor ruxolitinib, and also for patients who have constitutional symptoms, which happens in almost 3% of 3/4 of the patients, we again have the JAK2 inhibitor. Only 2 forms of treatment out of all these have been found to improve survival in this patient. The first is allogeneic stem cell transplantation, and the second is JAK2 inhibitors, ruxolitinib. And I'll show you some data to that effect in the subsequent slides. So let's talk about JAK2 inhibitors in myelofibrosis. I will restrict my talk to ruxolitinib because that is the only JAK2 inhibitor available to us. And in the subsequent talk, Dr. Hari Menon will tell you about new JAK2 inhibitors which are now at least approved in the US, and some other agents which are now being used for patients with myelofibrosis. So let's talk about ruxolitinib in the treatment of myelofibrosis. So this is how the JAK pathway impacts on the disease formation. Patients who have myelofibrosis have the JAK2 overactivated. There is an overactivated signaling, which leads to stimulation of the STAT pathway, which leads to increased signal transduction, increased survival, increased proliferation. So now when you use ruxolitinib, you block the JAK1 and the JAK2, you inhibit the dysregulated signal, and you reduce downstream signaling, and you reduce transcription, and you reduce the pressure on the cells for extra survival and proliferation, and you control the disease. So this is a potent ruxolitinib is a first-in-class agent which targets the JAK1 and JAK2. It's available in our country by the name of Jakavi. It's available in 5, 15, and 20 milligram tablets. These were the pivotal trials of ruxolitinib which were done. The COMFORT-1 trial was done in the United States, 1-to-1 randomization, 15, 20 milligrams twice a day of ruxolitinib, and the control arm was placebo. The COMFORT-2 trial was done in Europe and other parts of the world. There was a 2:1 randomization, and the control arm was best available therapy, which was the therapies which we've already talked about. A crossover was permitted, and 3 years down the line, 3 years in this trial, almost all patients in the control arm had switched over to ruxolitinib. So you can imagine that it is difficult to estimate overall survivals when a crossover is built into the study. The endpoints were here, and the primary endpoint was reduction in the spleen volume as measured by, not by palpation, but by MRI or CT scan. And in the COMFORT-2 also the primary endpoint was more than 35% reduction in spleen volume from baseline. And here you can see the results, the COMFORT-1 and the COMFORT-2 study. The majority of the patients had a significant reduction in splenomegaly, almost 50% in the ruxolitinib arm and negligible in the placebo arm. In the COMFORT-2 study, again, about 1/3 of the patients had a significant reduction in their spleen size at week 48. And it was also seen in these two studies that the reduction in spleen size happened very rapidly in the first 4 weeks in the ruxolitinib arm. One interesting fact which was also discovered in these two studies was that patients whether they had the JAK2 mutation or they did not. The dark colored red bars are patients who did not have the JAK2 mutation, but they still had the response to Jakavi, to ruxolitinib. So you can see here that for the JAK2 positive patients, there was a response rate in the spleen size of 88%. And for the negative patient, they also had a response rate of almost 91%. One of the most important findings of these studies was there was an excellent improvement in the patient's symptoms, abdominal discomfort, pain, left side of the abdomen, early satiety, night sweats, itching. All of them improved significantly in the ruxolitinib arm. It was also seen that this 6-minute walking test in patients who received ruxolitinib at 6 months' time, this walking had increased to 71 meters. All the patients, or the majority of the patients, also had an increase in their body weight while on ruxolitinib. It was also discovered in this study that patients who received the large dose of ruxolitinib, 20 milligrams per day, or 25 milligrams, 20 milligrams BD or 25 milligrams BD, had a much more significant response in the spleen volume as compared to those who received lower dose, less than 10 milligrams. And the same was also true for total symptom score. Patients who received the higher dose, 20 milligrams or 25 milligrams twice a day, they had a significantly more decrease in the symptom score as compared to the patients who received the lower dose. So the take-home message from here is that avoid starting with the low dose. And if you start with the low dose, then you should increase the dose to 20 milligrams twice a day or 25 milligrams twice a day, of course, depending upon tolerability, as quickly as possible. And this is again to tell you that patients who received 25 milligrams twice a day, they had quicker and more reduction in spleen and liver size as compared to patients who received lower dose of ruxolitinib. Now, did the molecule impact on survival? We have 6-year data now available, and the answer to this question is yes. Patients who received ruxolitinib versus patients who did not receive ruxolitinib, there was a very significant difference in overall survival at 6 years, 5.3 years versus 2.3 years, a very significant, very healthy hazard ratio. Did the bone marrow fibrosis decrease with ruxolitinib? There is preliminary evidence that in some patients at least, the bone marrow fibrosis decreased from grade 3 to grade 2, and in a minority of patients is also reduced from grade 3 to grade 0. And this is bone marrow morphology for you for these two studies. At 60 months, almost 1/3 of the patient had an improvement in their bone marrow fibrosis in the ruxolitinib arm, and a significant number of patients had either stabilization or improvement in their bone marrow fibrosis. So it does appear that this agent, the JAK2 inhibitor, ruxolitinib, is impacting on the natural history of myelofibrosis. And this is a little bit of the same, the grade of myelofibrosis did seem to improve in about half of the patients while on ruxolitinib at 24 months and at 48 months. What were the toxicity signals in these trials? As per the effect, as per the mechanism of action of the agent, it through the JAK2 pathway, it impacts on the JAK1 pathway, it impacts on platelets, red cells, white cells, lymphoid cells, and cytokines. And as a result, when you block these JAK pathways, you have toxicities which are thrombocytopenia, anemia, neutropenia, lymphopenia, and decreased cytokine, which is a positive thing, which is one thing which we want in our patients with myelofibrosis. About 14% of patients in the COMFORT-1 study and 17% of patients discontinued ruxolitinib, but the discontinuation rate because of AEs was about 10% in both the studies. So only a small number of patients have to discontinue the drug. The chief side effects, the higher grade side effects are anemia and thrombocytopenia, and they can happen in a significant number of patients, and you have to be aware of this. So, ladies and gentlemen, for the treatment of myelofibrosis, you have to personalize the treatment for patients who are low risk. You could consider only observation for them. You could consider ruxolitinib, and for the patients who are higher grade, you should think of allogeneic stem cell transplantation or a clinical trial. For patients who are intermediate to risk or high risk, first option which you should consider is allogeneic stem transplant. If because of age reasons or economics or inability to match the patient, you can't do this, then you should think of the JAK2 inhibitors. And this is again a little more elaboration of the same published in the Blood in 2019. So if I were to conclude my take-home messages, ruxolitinib availability has changed the routine clinical practice and the landscape in patients with myelofibrosis. Ruxolitinib alone is able to improve several risk factors linked to survival. It can reduce splenomegaly in a very large number of patients. This happens very quickly in 4 weeks' time. It is maintained over time, and this impacts on survival. It improves the symptoms, constitutional symptoms in a very large majority of the patients, and improves the quality of life of the patient. It improves cachexia, it increases weight, increases the walking distance which the patients have, and all this combined to improve the quality of life of these patients. For patients who have low risk, and if you give these patients ruxolitinib, they have fewer adverse effects, fewer discontinuations, and for patients, the JAK2 inhibitor impacts on quality of life by reducing the spleen size. Pardon me. You may also wish to consider starting treatment with JAK2 inhibitors earlier rather than late. The risk of toxicity infections has to be taken into consideration. The side effects of anemia and thrombocytopenia have to be taken into consideration. We have data to suggest that if you give full dose at the beginning, you are you're coming out ahead, and response is maintained over long durations of time. We are excited about the availability of other JAK2 inhibitors and other novel agents, which I'm sure will be addressed in details in the subsequent presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that I finish, and we will be taking questions during the panel discussion. And now I'd like to invite my very dear friend, Dr. Hari Menon, who is Senior Consultant Hematologist and Medical Oncologist at Cyticare Hospital in Bangalore. And Hari is going to be talking to us today about the new JAK2 inhibitors and the other new agents which are available to us in the field of myelofibrosis and myeloproliferative neoplasms. So, Hari, are you there? Hari, are you there?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
The screen is yours now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for the kind words, and a pleasure. Share. Yeah. I was given the talk on recent advances in treatment of myeloproliferative neoplasias beyond ruxolitinib, and since we are dealing with ruxolitinib mainly with myelofibrosis, I just modified it. I just focused mainly on the treatment of primary myelofibrosis and what we have understood in terms of newer drug availability for managing this otherwise difficult disease to treat. So we know that the major pathways that are associated with primary myelofibrosis involves the Janus kinase pathway, the signal transducer inactivator, the JAK-STAT pathway, and also most carry a driver mutation, which is JAK2, the MPL or the myeloproliferative leukemia, and the calreticulin genes. The calreticulin gene is the chaperonin gene. And we also know that there are epigenetic regulators and mutations in the epigenetic mechanisms and in the RNA splicing genes that occur, that play a critical role in the progression of myelofibrosis. So it is just not about targeting the JAK2 mutations that might potentially translate into benefits and control over the disease, but also managing the epigenetic mechanism may also have a role to play in controlling this disease. And this is just a cartoon to demonstrate that mainly the JAK2 mutations are through the erythropoietin receptors, the MPL, and the granulocyte colony stimulating factor receptors, and downstream signaling of the JAK-STAT pathway. And you have, to a lesser extent, the mutations involving the calreticulin gene and the MPL mutations, which again downstream works through the JAK-STAT pathway. And when we look at the evolutionary pathways in myeloproliferative neoplasia, there are three or four mechanisms. One, the hemopoietic stem cells accumulate certain somatic mutations, and then there is acquisition of certain or a second hit that we call, and then there is a clonal evolution which results in an advantage and a transformation into a disease. Sometimes you do have these mutations accumulated, but the second hit does not occur, and the patient tends to remain sort of long-term survivors without having a capability to go on to manifest the symptoms of the disease that we see. And sometimes you can have an acquisition of the mutation, what is known as a clonal expansion, and also and then you have development of the myeloproliferative neoplasia phenotype, followed by acquisition. So that's another pathway through which the MPN can progress. And sometimes you can just have an asymptomatic clonal expansion and a clonal evolution that we typically see, like, for example, in chronic myeloid leukemia, which results in the manifestation of the disease. So this has been alluded to. The COMFORT-1 study was exploring the molecule ruxolitinib. It's a JAK2 inhibitor, and this was against this is a phase 3 study which conducted in the United States, which clearly demonstrated an advantage in terms of improvement of quality of life and also overall survival benefits, predominantly through control of symptoms and also improvement of splenomegaly and improvement in the anemia. And across the Atlantic in Europe, the similar study was conducted, but you had it the other arm as the best available therapy. And here again, we saw the profound response was as far as the spleen was concerned, and there was distinctly a survival benefit in these patients as against those on best available therapy. And a pooled analysis of the COMFORT-1 and COMFORT-2 study also demonstrated a significant survival benefit, even keeping in mind those patients who had had crossed over to ruxolitinib after 48 weeks of treatment. But what we must understand is that in terms of the allele burden, we would have intuitively thought that because it's a target, it would bring down the allele burden, but that did not happen both in the COMFORT-1 and the COMFORT-2 study, and there was only a very, very modest reduction in the allele burden. And if you want to actually see a decrease in the allele burden, perhaps there was a need to combine it with interferon, which definitely produced a decrease in allele burden. So that is why we tend to get ruxolitinib failures patients over a period of time. So you can have four scenarios. One is a primary response where there is no response at all, no change in spleen size, no reduction in the spleen-related symptoms, or the target of less than 50% reduction in the myeloproliferative neoplasia indices. And you have secondary resistance, that is after some responses, you have a loss of the response, or on some situations, you can have intolerance to the medications, especially related to a drop in platelets or doubling of the requirement for transfusions, and unacceptable treatment emergent toxicity, including infection. So you can have a progression, which is actually a transformation into a myeloid leukemia, where there is an increase in blast percentage, and also where we have an increase in the spleen after having a initial response. So those are the headings under which we would categorize failure of ruxolitinib. We do understand that failure can be also a result of presence of certain epigenetic mutations, especially associated with ASXL1 and the EZH2 and the DNMT3. And you will appreciate from this graph that there is a huge difference and the survival is impacted by the presence or absence of these mutations. And again, cumulative, all the three presents have a worse prognosis versus having two versus one. So each of them impacting the outcomes in these patients. So you have intrinsic ruxolitinib resistance, one would say, when you have these kind of mutations in the patient. So what are the things that actually result in resistance? So in myeloproliferative, the JAK2 signaling pathways is constitutively activated, we know that. And the JAK2 and the JAK2 V616 mutation in most cases are alternatively by the JAK2 exon 12 or the MPL or the CALR mutations. So you can have a type 1 JAK2 inhibitor to stabilize the JAK2 active site, which is in its phosphorylate form, and thereby suppress downstream signaling pathway. So that is one of the targets. But generally, you don't see that coming across so frequently. And now, if you look at the cartoon in the diagram in C, you will see that potentially there can be genetic resistance to type 1 JAK2 inhibition due to resistant mutations that develop at the site. But again, this is usually seen in vitro and rarely seen in vivo. But one of the other mechanisms is the resistance to type 1 JAK2 inhibition in the absence of acquired second site mutations. So thereby, the JAK2 family heterodimer formation with DYK2 or transactivation of the JAK2 leading to persistent JAK2 signaling, thereby even though there is some blockade of the receptor, there is downstream signaling continuing through alternate pathways. So there is an effort to look at whether there can be other mechanisms that can lead to a better inhibition of the and this led to the newer medications such as selective JAK2 inhibitors, and one of them was fedratinib, which was a selective JAK2 inhibitor, and this was first studied in the study what is known as the Jakarta-1 study, which evaluated 2 doses of fedratinib versus placebo, and which showed significantly superior benefits as far as the spleen size is concerned. This was seen in both treatment arms, irrespective of the dose. Then came the Jakarta-2 study, which was actually a phase 2 study, which was evaluating fedratinib in patients who were intolerant of ruxolitinib. So this is one of the first studies actually exploring a new JAK2 inhibitor against an earlier JAK2 inhibitor, which is ruxolitinib. And the responses with regards to spleen volume reduction were quite compelling. But what was seen in this study was that there was a suggestion of increased insular wernicase encephalopathy in these patients. And because of this reason, the FDA suspended the study for some time, but subsequently it was restarted and it was further investigated when the more detailed investigation did only a causal relationship and not a direct relationship to this. So this is the Jakarta-2 study, which clearly demonstrated a profound influence on decreasing the splenic volume. And more importantly, one must understand that these were patients who were also intolerant or resistant to ruxolitinib, thereby saying there was activity. And this was one of the most important effects of fedratinib in fibrosis. So the splenic responses also, as per protocol, was quite found, and it was equal in both ruxolitinib intolerant and resistant patient, though the patients who were intolerant to ruxolitinib had perhaps a little better response than those who were resistant to ruxolitinib. The next drug in the armamentarium was more of a multi-kinase inhibitor, which is pacritinib, which had a lot of promise when it came into clinical trials. And this is an oral inhibitor of JAK2, FLT3, RAC1 and CSF1 receptor. So there were studies. One was the PERSIST-1 and the PERSIST-2 study. The PERSIST-1 study, the phase 3 study, a randomized control study, wherein JAK inhibitor naive myelofibrosis with any degree of anemia and thrombocytopenia were enrolled. The key findings was that pacritinib, there was a splenic decrease in splenic size of greater than 35% at week 24 with pacritinib, which was seen about 19% of the patient, whereas it was seen only in about 5% of the patients in the best supportive arm. But if you look at the PERSIST-2 study, which is a phase 3 randomized control study in myelofibrosis, which also allowed previous use of JAK2 inhibitors, and also allowed for patients to be enrolled who had less than 100,000 platelet count, again, you found that just like the PERSIST-1 study, there was a profound impact in terms of the splenic volume response. And the subsequent phase 2 dose-finding trial in high-risk myelofibrosis also is looking at 200 milligram BD. But again, there was a roadblock for pacritinib because there was an increased incidence seen of intracranial hemorrhage and cardiac failure with cardiac arrest, and it was held in 2017. But subsequently, the phase 3 Pacifica study is ongoing and the results are awaited. So the next JAK2 inhibitor that was looked at is momelotinib, which has activity against the activin receptors believed to contribute to remarkable anemia in myelofibrosis. This was a phase 3 study called the Simplify study that evaluated momelotinib. Despite showing a compelling anemia response, it failed to show superiority or non-inferiority in a primary or key secondary endpoint. And this is the Simplify study, which clearly demonstrated a response in terms of decrease in the splenic size, but it was in about 50% of the patient, and did not show that much of a benefit as against the best available therapy at that time.
Apologies for interrupting. Can you wind up in a couple of minutes?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So, and the other thing, which is a different molecule altogether, is a telomerase inhibitor, which is imelestat, which looked at 2 different dosing, very promising in terms of decreasing the splenic volume and improving the platelet count, and also improving the anemia. And there was a distinct survival benefit in these patients for the 9.4 milligram per kilogram of almost 29.9 months. The important thing that we looked, which is luspatercept, which is first-in-class erythroid maturation agent and binding to the transforming growth factor beta, which has been demonstrated to have excellent responses in beta thalassemia to improve the. It was a key presentation in 2018 and at ASH, and this has been demonstrated to have improvement in anemia even in myelofibrosis patient. And the initial results from ongoing phase 2 studies suggest clinical activity for luspatercept in patients with myelofibrosis in anemia. The other important thing, which I'll finish in 1 minute, is combining with older agents, ruxolitinib with thalidomide. And in a nutshell, this was the study, phase 2 study, which looked at the run-in to thalidomide in those patients who were not completely getting transfusion independent. And clearly, there was a 39% of transfusion-dependent patients achieved red cell transfusion independence in the phase 2 study, and this was demonstrated by various. Thereby, there may be a role for adding thalidomide to ruxolitinib in improving transfusion requirements. The hypomethylating agent azacitidine has always been there. It was a study which looked at azacitidine with ruxolitinib. Clearly, there was an improvement in improving the splenic symptoms and decreasing the spleen size in these patients. So, in conclusion, I would say that Optimum definition of ruxolitinib failure intolerance is still undefined, but having said that, we need to look at cytopenias, treatment-related adverse events, and progression of the disease as key markers to define ruxolitinib failure. Treatment of patient with ruxolitinib failure intolerance is definitely an unmet need, and patient with persistent splenomegaly or symptoms can be considered for combining ruxolitinib with azacitidine, and for patients with cytopenias, JAK2 inhibitors such as pacritinib and momelotinib may hold promise, and the newer drug, which is a telomerase inhibitor, imelostat, also has shown great promise. And investigational therapy should always be considered for patients with myelofibrosis, and preliminary data suggests several novel agents approaches have a significant activity. I will conclude with that.
Thank you very much, Hari, for a very, very nice talk on the recent advances in the treatment of myelofibrosis and ruxolitinib resistance. And please don't go away. I think there will be a lot of questions to you. And now we come to the next part of the presentation of this webinar. And it's a pleasure to invite my very dear friend and also the program coordinator of this webinar, Dr. Lalit Mohan Sharma. I think all of you know Dr. Lalit Mohan Sharma. He is a senior consultant medical oncologist at the Bhagwan Mahavir Cancer Hospital in Jaipur. And he's going to be today doing a case-based panel discussion. He will have cases for you, and then he'll introduce his panel to you. And I'm handing over the screen to Dr. Lalit. Lalit, all yours.
Sir. Thank you, sir. Screen visible.
Maybe on show and then
One second. Ending this. Durrani, he is director in the Department of Hemato-Oncology and BMT services at Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Hospital in Delhi. Thank you, Dr. Burani. Along with him, Dr. Deepak Shukla, he is senior consultant medical oncologist at Manipal Hospital. And Dr. Mukul could not join us right now. Dr. Surendra Diwali is professor in the Department of Medical Oncology at SP Medical College, Bikaner. Dr. Vishnu Sharma is a recent addition in Department of Hematology. He is associate professor. I apologize for writing the wrong designation. He is associate professor in the Department of Internal Medicine, and he is looking after the hematology. He is the recent addition in our Jaipur fraternity. So let us start with the real life case. So this is Mr. Adil, 52-year-old male, who presented in September 2007. And his major complaints were giddiness, weakness, fatigue. He had transient blackouts of 3 to 6 months duration. Examination revealed liver 6 centimeters, spleen 8 centimeter, and these are his CBC report: 17.1, TLC 27,000, platelet 4,23,000. The hematocrit was 62%, uric acid mildly raised, LDH also raised, and we did a serum EPO that was erythropoietin, which was also normal in this case. So my question to the panelists, I will start with Dr. Deepak Shukla, that do you advise bone marrow in all these patients?
Yes, sir. Considering this case in particular, he is having though elevated hemoglobin that is beyond the WHO criteria, that is 16.5, but his erythropoietin level is normal. So in presence of normal erythropoietin in this patient, I'll definitely go for a bone marrow aspiration, bone biopsy. And also, as per the WHO guidelines, that bone marrow aspiration and bone biopsy is a major criteria now. Though in a subset of patients who are having a hemoglobin that is persistently in males greater than 18.5 and in females 16.5, with the other criteria like JAK2 and erythropoietin in sub normal range, we can omit in such cases, but routinely we do a bone marrow aspiration, bone biopsy.
Very true. So I think this has been very well discussed, that it is important to do. Of course, in particular subset of patient, the bone marrow may not be required, but it diagnoses fibrosis at diagnosis, which may be prevalent from 15% to almost 50%, which is very important. And again, post-myelofibrosis also can be picked up, like patients who present very late to us. And this diagnostic criteria has already been mentioned about the diagnosis of TB, so we will not spend more time in this. So next question is that how do we further evaluate? So may I start with Dr. Surinder Beniwal, who is from Bikaner. Dr. Surinder, may I ask you that how do we approach after doing a bone marrow? Which are the other tests you would like to do in this particular patient?
So primarily, this case looks like. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Primarily, this case looks like a polycythemia vera. So we have to do bone marrow as well as karyotyping to rule out other rare molecular abnormalities, as well as JAK2 mutation with the reflex panel. If JAK2 mutation is negative, then we have to do for another type of panels. But we have to do JAK2 mutation and bone marrow with the karyotyping, and we have to do other workup, polycythemia vera, like any risk factor for thrombosis or any cardiovascular risk factor, and then we have to stop it.
Indeed. Dr. Hari, you are here and probably you were in Tata Hospital when I have discussed this patient. Very well affording person, and he wanted that each quantitative JAK2 mutation have any impact on management of these patients. It was positive qualitative.
Not really, because if you look at the studies, as far as ruxolitinib is concerned, it did not matter whether you were having JAK2 or JAK2 positive or negative. And in terms of the allele burden, it does not bring down the allele burden either. So to me, it does not matter whether it doesn't appear to matter as far as the allele, the amount of JAK2 mutations present or not. That's my observation.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Dinesh Purani is here. Dr. Dinesh, may I ask you that when do you ask for MPN reflex panel with all the molecular markers, or when do you ask only for the JAK? Sometimes the cost remains one issue with many of our patients.
All the myeloproliferative disorders, we should do a BCR-ABL test.
Right.
If BCR-ABL is negative, then only you should proceed with the others. Because sometimes you can have a high hemoglobin with the different criteria, and you may find even a thrombocytosis can be a presentation of CML. Once the BCR-ABL is negative, I usually go serially, so doing a JAK2. And if JAK2 is negative, then you go for a, especially in polycythemia rubra, you won't find the TELR and others are very rare. You have to go for JAK14 mutation rather than looking for the TELR and other markers. So JAK2 should be enough in polycythemia vera once you have done BCR-ABL.
So next question is Dr. Jay Mehta. Yeah, are you there? Dr. Jay Mehta, are you there?
I think the morphology is most important. So
wanted to ask in fact about the lab standards, like many laboratories are there in coming to us, to clinicians, and sitting in our clinics, how do we identify that this lab is good and how to make sure that whatever we are getting is the right reports? So Dr. Dinesh Purani, can you comment upon this?
you need a good hematopathologist. So Dr. Jay is one of the good hematopathologists, especially on the bone marrow biopsy, because the biopsy features will differentiate whether it is a polycythemia, myelofibrosis, or ET. If you see a 2008 and 2016 classification, the significant movement has been, there was a less importance to the bone marrow biopsy in 2008, and then the WHO itself